She didn't know who she was yet. That's what Dr. Ashford believed as he watched her move through the pre-dawn corridors of Oak Creek Memorial, a competent nurse with steady hands and the kind of invisibility that comes from never asking for anything. He had no idea the slight limp favoring her left side was from a combat wound sustained under fire in Tikrit. He had no idea those hands had once held a perimeter for 6 hours while treating wounded soldiers with nothing but gauze and morphine and the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst. She was just Elena, the quiet one, the nurse who never questioned orders and never drew attention to herself, exactly the kind of staff member that kept hierarchies functioning smoothly. Elena Martinez had spent 3 years rebuilding her life in the fluorescent hum of Oak Creek Memorial, a 247-bed hospital on the edge of Portland where nobody asked about her past and she asked nothing of anyone else. The antiseptic smell and cold steel gurneys were a deliberate choice, as far from the desert as geography could take her. She moved through the pre-shift briefing with the same precision she'd once moved through Fallujah, shoulders back, breathing steady, scanning exits without seeming to. The veteran nurses knew her as the one who never shook during codes, who could start fours in collapsed veins on the first try, whose presence during a trauma seemed to lower blood pressure just by existing in the room. They didn't know why. She didn't tell them. In her scrub pocket, she carried a single dog tag on a broken chain. Just one. She touched it during difficult cases, a habit born from loss, a weight she carried alone during the 13-hour shifts that filled her calendar. The metal was warm from her body temperature by mid-morning, smooth from thousands of touches over 3 years. Nobody knew whose name was engraved on it. Nobody asked. That was the agreement she'd made with herself: reinvent quietly, heal without talking, exist in the spaces between other people's dramas. It had worked perfectly until the moment a Navy helicopter's rotor wash shook the emergency bay windows at 06 for 7 hours. The sound came first, the distinctive thud-thud-thud of a UH-60M Black Hawk's rotors, the pitch changing as the pilots decelerated for landing. Military bird. Elena was in the medication room restocking epinephrine auto-injectors when the vibration traveled up through her feet. Her hand stilled for exactly one breath. Just one. The helicopter was supposed to be on the mainland, somewhere near Joint Base Lewis McChord. Not here. Not at Oak Creek Memorial in downtown Portland, where the only military presence was the occasional wounded warrior from the VA across town. She finished counting the auto-injectors, 17 total, 3 needed replacement by end of shift, and moved toward the trauma bay with the same unhurried pace she brought to every task. Muscle memory whispered a different rhythm underneath her movements. Combat medicine wasn't taught in most nursing programs. It was taught in field conditions with inadequate resources and the constant calculation of triage: who lives, who doesn't, how many minutes until the bleeding stops or the body gives out. She'd carried that knowledge across the country in her muscle memory, in her bones, in the way her eyes automatically assessed blood volume and tissue damage before her rational mind even caught up. The Black Hawk descended with the precision of experienced Night Stalker's pilots, their rotors churning the air above the landing pad attached to the east wing of the hospital. Wind hammered the reinforced windows, scattering loose papers and a coffee cup left on the emergency desk. 2 paramedics in desert camouflage fatigues moved with the economical efficiency of soldiers who'd done this 100 times in places where the geography could kill you as fast as the enemy. Elena positioned herself at the trauma bay entrance, hands already moving, grabbing a level 1 rapid infuser from the crash cart, confirming the monitors were running, making space for incoming severity. The stretcher came through the doors at a run. Male. 60s. Shrapnel wounds to the right side, entry wounds suggesting IED fragmentation, blood saturation on the combat bandages applied maybe 90 minutes prior. Critical. But Elena's attention narrowed to his face in the fractional second before the paramedics transferred him to the hospital gurney. Recognition hit like shrapnel of its own. General Marcus Webb. 3-star. Commander of the Joint Operations Task Force that had coordinated her son's unit in Tikrit. The man who'd sent her the letters after her son died, who'd called her personally from a secure line, whose voice had cracked when he asked if there was anything at all, that he could do. She'd said no. She meant yes. Nothing could be done. Her son was gone. General Webb had sent flowers. Flowers seemed obscene for a death. Elena had thrown them away. The recognition lasted less than a second. Her face showed nothing. The lurch in her chest registered as data, elevated heart rate, adrenaline spike, sympathetic nervous system activation, and she filed it away the same way she filed away pain, as information to process later, in private, if at all. She moved into the trauma bay with the rest of the team, hands already knowing the choreography. Oxygen. For access. Cardiac monitoring. The monitor showed a heart rate of 112, blood pressure 88/56 and dropping. Not stable. She swallowed once and focused on the vitals climbing across the screen. Blast injury, IED fragmentation, sustained approximately 90 minutes ago in Rogue River tactical training exercise, the paramedic reported, reading from the field notes with the clipped precision of military personnel. Pressure dressings applied at scene. 2 units of whole blood administered by medevac medic. Patient conscious, oriented to person and place, complained of chest pain and difficulty breathing. We got a pulse on scene. Never lost him. Never lost him. Elena's hands moved to the suction catheter, clearing his airway with the smooth competence of someone who'd done this in worse conditions with worse equipment. General Webb's eyes tracked her for just a moment, recognition flickering there, a question forming, before she turned away to complete the assessment. Not now. Not here. The professional distance she'd built between Elena the nurse and Elena the soldier held firm as reinforced concrete. Dr. Ashford arrived precisely 4 minutes after the patient had been transferred to the hospital gurney. He was chief of medicine, which meant he ran trauma assessments with the kind of confident authority that came from 23 years of making decisions in hierarchies where his word was law. He moved with the subtle arrogance of a man who'd never been questioned in any meaningful way, who believed that rank and credentials constituted wisdom. His eye swept the trauma bay, registered the general, and his entire demeanor shifted toward deference, the muscle memory of a man who understood power structures intimately. General Webb. His voice carried warmth now, the tone he reserved for people he considered actual peers. We'll get you stabilized. I'm Dr. Ashford, Chief of Medicine. I'm assuming command of your care personally. The general's breathing was labored, his color poor, oxygen saturation reading 94% and falling. Elena continued the assessment without comment, noting his respiratory rate at 24, the way his chest rose asymmetrically. Pneumothorax. Possibly tension. The cardiac monitor showed sinus rhythm, but his blood pressure was trending downward in a way that suggested ongoing internal bleeding. She reached for the portable ultrasound unit. She'd worked trauma long enough to know what certain combinations of vital sign changes suggested, even without saying them aloud. 15-minute trauma protocol, she asked quietly, directing the question to Dr. Ashford but keeping her hands moving through the assessment. Start with the baseline, the standard protocol that had saved 10,000 lives and counting. Stabilize, image, reassess. Dr. Ashford glanced at her with the mildest expression of irritation, the kind that said she'd committed some minor social offense by speaking when unaddressed. We'll proceed as indicated by the clinical presentation, Nurse Martinez. I'll make the calls regarding protocol. The words were sharp enough to cut, embedded in his tone the implication that the hierarchy was clear, he thought, she executed. She didn't respond. She simply nodded once and repositioned the ultrasound probe over his abdomen, her fingers moving with surgical precision born from 4 years of field medicine in conditions where imaging was rare and physical assessment was everything. Combat assessment didn't require machines. It required the ability to read a body like a map, to understand what bleeding internally looked like in the subtle changes of skin color and pupil response and capillary refill. The general's eyes found her again as she worked. There was something in his gaze, the memory of a name on her scrub pocket badge that didn't match the face, perhaps, or just the basic human recognition that this particular nurse's hands were moving with a confidence that suggested more experience than any civilian hospital job would typically require. But she didn't meet his gaze. She kept her face neutral, professional, the mask of a competent healthcare worker performing her assigned duties. The dog tag in her pocket was warm against her thigh. She didn't touch it. Not yet. The cardiac monitor changed its rhythm abruptly. What happened next didn't just shift the tenor of the morning, it brought the careful separation between Elena's two lives to the edge of collision. The cardiac monitor's rhythm shifted, and Elena moved without thinking. She was at the bedside before Ashford finished his sentence, her eyes tracking the pattern on the screen, not the erratic spike he'd expected, but something else entirely. Something that told a different story. "We should consult cardiology first," she said, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "His rhythm suggests pericardial effusion, not anxiety. The pressure buildup could be compressing the heart chambers." The general's daughter froze mid-breath. His son-in-law's hand tightened on the bed rail. Dr. Ashford turned slowly. His face was already beginning to redden, the color climbing from his collar like mercury in a thermometer. "Nurse Martinez, are you questioning my medical judgment?" Elena met his eyes. No hesitation. No apology in her posture. "I'm questioning your diagnosis, doctor." The room went dead silent. Ashford's jaw tightened. He was a man whose authority had never been challenged by someone wearing scrubs, not in this hospital, not in any hospital where he'd worked his way up through 3 decades of hierarchical precision. His voice, when it came again, wasn't louder. It was worse than loud. It was the quiet voice of a man about to destroy someone, savoring every word. "Let me remind you, nurse," he said, spacing the word out like he was speaking to someone who didn't understand English, "that in this hospital, you follow orders. You don't give them. You're a technician. A technician with steady hands, perhaps, but not a physician. Not a diagnostician. If you can't remember your place in this hierarchy, perhaps you need remedial training. Mandatory. With Dr. Paulson in the basement lab." How does that sound? The general's daughter made a small sound, something between a gasp and a plea. Elena took one measured breath. Just one. She didn't look away from Ashford's eyes. Her hand moved to her scrub pocket, where the dog tag on its broken chain pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. She touched it once, and then her fingers came away to wipe a single tear from her cheekbone. Not trembling. Not breaking. Just acknowledging that some things hurt, and then moving forward anyway. "I've seen men die from arrogance disguised as authority," she said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke. Ashford's face drained of color for a moment, just a moment, and then the red came back, darker than before. He turned away without responding, but his shoulders were rigid as he moved toward the door, his hands balled into fists at his sides. The general's family stood frozen, unsure whether they'd witnessed a medical consultation or a public execution. Elena checked the 4-line with methodical precision. 12 milliliters per hour, steady infusion, no infiltration. Everything exactly as it should be. Her voice, when she spoke to the family, was professional and calm. "I'll speak with the cardiology team," she said. It won't take long. By the time she reached the unit board 2 hours later, the formal write-up was already posted. Ashford's handwriting was precise, almost elegant, which somehow made it worse. Gross insubordination and undermining of physician authority in patient care environment. Nurse Martinez demonstrated flagrant disregard for chain of command and basic professional conduct. Requires immediate disciplinary review. It was positioned at eye level, where every staff member would see it. Where families would see it. Where patients who could read would see it. Elena stood in front of it for exactly 4 seconds, then turned and walked toward the break room. The smell hit her first, burnt coffee and the faint chemical tang of industrial cleaner that never quite masked the hospital's underlying scent of antiseptic and something older, something like fear that had seeped into the walls over decades. The break room was Elena's private geography on this shift, the one place where the day nurses were supposed to coexist in careful neutrality. She was wrong about that. For veteran nurses were gathered at the far table, Sarah, who'd worked trauma for 16 years, Michelle, who'd trained Elena on the unit protocols, James, who'd always nodded when they passed in the hallway, and Patricia, the charge nurse who'd advocated for her during hiring. They stood simultaneously when Elena entered, gathered their lunch trays with the synchronized precision of a choreographed retreat, and moved to the other side of the break room without a word. Not one word. The silence that followed had weight. It pressed down like humidity before a storm. Elena sat at her original table with her lunch container, turkey sandwich, apple, small bag of pretzels, and ate with the methodical efficiency of someone following a mission checklist. Bite. Chew. Swallow. Repeat. The fork made soft clicking sounds against the plastic container, the only percussion in a room that suddenly felt cavernous. The door opened. Dr. Ashford entered, moving with the casual confidence of someone who'd just won a skirmish. He walked directly to the coffee maker, his back to her. Elena watched him measure out grounds with deliberate slowness, 1 scoop, 2 scoops, 3, and then pour water into the machine with the kind of theatrical care usually reserved for rituals. He stirred his coffee when it finished, the spoon making slow circles, and then he turned. He made eye contact with her across the room. A long, measured look that said everything his mouth didn't need to say. That said he'd calculated her isolation and found it satisfactory. That said he was already planning his next move. Elena didn't look away. She took another bite of her sandwich, chewed it completely, and swallowed. What they didn't know was that every single thing Ashford was doing was a blueprint. Every move he made was being catalogued by a part of her brain that had been trained to read tactical advantage and defensive positioning. The combat injury in Tikrit that had taken her out of active service had taken her out of the field, but it hadn't taken the field out of her. She could see the geometry of his strategy as clearly as she could read a chest X-ray. Ashford left, his coffee untouched on the counter. The veteran nurses remained at their isolated table, eating in synchronized silence, the kind of coordinated avoidance that only came from a pre-planned conversation. Elena finished her lunch, rinsed her container, and walked back out to her assigned section of the hospital, the pediatric wing, where no trauma cases arrived, where no critical decisions needed to be made, where she could be supervised by someone who wasn't Ashford but who would definitely report back to him. It wasn't punishment. It was erasure. But erasure only worked on people who could be erased, and Elena had learned a long time ago in a place called Tikrit that some people were built differently. Some people had roots that went deeper than organizational charts could measure. She worked her shift with the kind of precision that made the few nurses she encountered wonder if maybe they'd made a mistake abandoning her, but she didn't say anything to them. Didn't need to. Silence was strategic now. Her hand found the dog tag around midnight, when the pediatric wing was nothing but monitors beeping softly for sleeping children and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The chain had broken years ago, somewhere between the Medevac helicopter and Walter Reed, and she'd never had it repaired. Broken things felt more honest. The dog tag itself was worn smooth from handling, scratched titanium that had rested against someone else's chest for 3 years before he gave it to her at his funeral. Before his widow had pressed it into Elena's hand and whispered, "He always said you were the bravest one. He said you saved his life twice." She held it now, standing in the supply room surrounded by pediatric equipment she'd never use, remembering the general's voice at the memorial service in Arlington. The way he'd approached her afterward, the way his hand had gripped her shoulder like he was trying to anchor himself to something that wouldn't disappear. Her phone buzzed at 1:53 a.m. Unknown number. Text message. For words, general web crashing. Now. Elena's breath caught. She read it again. For words from someone who knew her well enough to send it, knew the risks well enough to do it anyway. The ICU nurses weren't supposed to contact floor staff about reassigned patients. It was policy. It was protocol. It was Ashford's new law. She moved without thinking, the same instinct that had made her push a general out of the path of an IED, the same muscle memory that had held a perimeter for 6 hours with 3 different field dressings bleeding through. She ran, and the night shift dissolved into pure motion. The security reader at the ICU entrance flashed red. Access denied. Through the reinforced glass, she could see the general's room. The code team was already there, 3 nurses and 2 doctors, and the crash cart positioned like a predator over prey. The monitors above his bed showed the electrical chaos of ventricular fibrillation, the heart not beating, just quivering, a muscle that had forgotten how to work. And Ashford was there, his hands visibly shaking as he barked orders that no one seemed quite sure how to follow. The general's daughter was screaming in the hallway, her voice raw and ancient with the kind of grief that makes strangers turn away. Elena turned when a side door opened, a maintenance worker she'd helped once, 3 months ago, when his daughter had been admitted with appendicitis and he'd been terrified. He'd worked the pediatric wing that day, and Elena had sat with him for 10 minutes during his break, just listened while he talked about how scared he was. Small kindness. The kind that creates invisible debts. She caught the ICU door as it swung shut behind him. The security sensors didn't trigger. The cameras didn't register. Sometimes the bravest thing you could do was walk through a door that was already open, while everyone else was watching a screen that wasn't showing the real threat. Elena moved into the trauma bay with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The pediatric wing of Oak Creek Memorial at night was a different hospital entirely. Fluorescent lights hummed their lonely frequency down corridors lined with cartoon murals and stuffed animal donation bins, the cheerful trappings of a place that healed children now serving as a warehouse for a nurse no one wanted to see. Elena had been reassigned there 3 hours after Ashford's public humiliation, the formal write-up already posted on the unit board where everyone could read it, insubordination. Question direct physician order. Undermine chain of command. The words were meant to sting. They didn't. She had read worse on condolence letters after Tikrit. The night shift stretched before her like open desert. Vitals checks on sleeping 6-year-olds with broken arms, midnight antibiotic runs, the grateful silence of parents who had cried themselves out and finally dozed in the recliners beside their children's beds. Elena moved through it all with the same methodical precision she brought to everything, careful hand placement to avoid waking them, checking drip rates with a nurse's competence that no write-up could diminish. Her phone sat in her scrub pocket, the screen dark and heavy. She had disabled notifications 3 hours ago because watching the general's ICU status update in real time, the monitors she could no longer access in person, the vital signs updated by nursing staff she used to work alongside, was like watching someone drown from across a glass wall. At 11:33 p.m., she pulled up the hospital's patient portal on a shared computer in the pediatric break room, the one everyone forgot collected crumbs and spilled coffee. The portal was restricted. Ashford had been thorough, inserting a formal access limitation through the hospital's policy system, RN Elena Martinez, pediatric wing assignment effective immediately. ICU access revoked per Department of Medicine directive. Authorized physician, Dr. James Ashford, MD. The restriction had been processed at 2:31 p.m., just 4 hours after he'd humiliated her in front of a trauma family. 4 hours to mobilize the hospital's HR system. 4 hours to erase her from the patient she recognized. She didn't have access to the ICU monitor feeds anymore, but there was another way. The hospital's publicly available census system, designed for visitor information and emergency notifications, still showed room assignments and basic status indicators. General Marcus Webb, room for 12. Status, critical. Last update, 11:44 p.m. No other details. She refreshed the page. The page refreshed. The page refreshed again. This was how she kept watch now. This was the cage Ashford had built. The night deepened. Midnight passed. Elena completed her rounds, 2 children sleeping through pain management, 1 teenager awake at 12:33 a.m. with anxiety about surgery scheduled for morning, and Elena sat with her in the dark, one hand on the teenager's shoulder, not speaking, just present, which was all anyone needed at 3 in the morning. The girl slept. Elena continued her vigil on the pediatric computer. At 1:15 a.m., the hospital's PA system crackled to life with routine overhead noise, something about a delivery in pharmacy, a code for housekeeping in the West Wing. She had learned, after 3 years of nursing, to listen to the hospital's language the way soldiers listen to radio static. Most people heard nothing. Elena heard the entire nervous system of the building. At 1:44 a.m., Ashford appeared on the pediatric unit, a breach of protocol so obvious it confirmed what Elena had already known. He pushed through the staff entrance with the kind of velocity that meant something had broken. He didn't see her seated in the break room. His phone was against his ear. "I don't care if it's the middle of the night," Ashford said to whoever was listening. "I want the night shift assignments reconfirmed. Martinez is on pediatrics, confirmed. The general stays under my protocols. No crossover. No consultations. If that nurse tries to access the ICU, I want incident reports filed before her second step through the doors." He ended the call. He stood in the hallway for exactly 8 seconds, his chest rising and falling, then turned and left. Elena did not move from her chair. The break room lights hummed. The coffee machine ticked through its cooling cycle. She had been dismissed by institutions before, smaller ones, but the mechanism was always identical. Isolate. Restrict. Control the information flow. Make the target radioactive. Ashford was good at this. Ashford was a professional at this. She returned to the census page. Room for 12. Still critical. Still breathing. At 1:53 a.m., Elena performed her final pediatric rounds. The 6-year-old in 401 had drifted deeper into painless sleep. The post-op teenager in 408 had finally stopped calling for her mother. The anxiety case in 410 had surrendered to exhaustion. All stable. All monitored. All secure. Elena made her notes, careful, precise entries that any auditor could review, and she returned to the break room to sit in the fluorescent dark and wait for the moment she already knew was coming. Hospitals have a sound signature. An experienced nurse learns to read it the way wildlife experts read bird calls. The machines that sustain people emit frequencies, the reassuring blip of monitors, the whoosh of ventilators, the intermittent alarm cascade of ICUs where patients hang suspended between recovery and crisis. At 2:03 a.m., that signature changed. The alarm was distant, filtered through 2 hallways and a secured door, but it had the exact pitch of a general cardiac arrest alarm. Not a routine monitor disconnect. Not a loose lead. A patient in full decompensation, the kind that sets off a cascade of secondary alarms, the overhead page system, the crash cart deployment, the particular silence that falls across a hospital when someone is actively dying. Code blue, ICU, the operator's voice called through the PA system. Code blue, room for 12. All ICU personnel respond. Elena did not think. She stood. The dog tag on the broken chain pressed against her collarbone, her son's name worn thin from 18 years of being touched, carried, held. She moved through the dark pediatric corridors with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The secured ICU door was behind the main pharmacy, access restricted to authorized personnel, accessible only with ID badge credentials. Elena's credentials had been flagged, but the badge itself was still active, just flagged in the digital system, not physically deactivated. She slid it through the reader. The lock stayed engaged. She tried again. Still engaged. Ashford had been efficient. The code continued somewhere behind that door. She could hear the crash cart's wheels squeaking against linoleum, could hear the rapid-fire voice of someone performing chest compressions, could hear the attending surgeon saying something about defibrillation. Elena moved toward the service entrance used by housekeeping and food services, security cameras trained on it, but the physical lock was a simple push mechanism designed for staff with both hands full of supplies. She entered. The sound intensified. Room for 12 was 17 paces forward, 4th door on the right. The door was open because nothing stays closed during a code. The scene was controlled chaos held barely in check. The attending surgeon, Dr. Patterson, was calling out orders, push epi, 1 mg 4, while the ICU resident performed chest compressions with the mechanical precision of someone counting seconds in their head. The monitor showed asystole, the flatline rhythm that meant the heart had stopped entirely. 3 rounds of epinephrine. The rhythm had not changed. One of the nurses noticed her standing in the doorway, but before she could speak, Elena stepped inside. "He needs a pericardiocentesis," Elena said from the threshold. Her voice was steady and quiet, the kind of voice that cuts through noise without raising volume. Dr. Ashford spun. He was standing against the far wall, and his face went through three distinct emotions in rapid succession: recognition, fury, authority. "Security," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "This nurse is not authorized to be in this ICU. Remove her immediately." The general's heart monitor continued its flat line. The compressions continued. 30 seconds of epinephrine with no effect. 40 seconds. The attending surgeon hesitated for a fraction of a second, that millisecond of decision-making where he was weighing Ashford's assertion of authority against the patient's declining status. "I said now," Ashford's voice rose. "Security. Get her out." The general's daughter, who had been standing behind her father's chair for the past 16 hours, made a sound like a wounded animal. The monitor remained flat. The rhythm remained absent. Elena did not wait for security. She moved into the room with the kind of precision that comes from having performed emergency procedures in conditions far worse than climate-controlled trauma bays. The crash cart was positioned to her right, every hospital configured similarly, muscle memory made perfect. She grabbed the scalpel from the emergency kit, the field blade rather than the sterile surgical implements, because she did not have time for the sterile field. "Elena," Dr. Patterson started, recognizing her. She had already begun. The fourth and fifth intercostal space, left anterior axillary line, the anatomical landmarks memorized from a different life, in a different desert, on a different kind of mission. Her hands moved with the kind of certainty that made the attending surgeon step back half a step, giving her the space she needed. The blade entered between ribs with the particular resistance of living tissue, and she extended the incision with the methodical focus of someone who had done this before the war ended, when evacuations weren't coming and field medicine meant the difference between going home and not going home. The membrane separated. She reached into the chest cavity, her fingers finding the pericardium, and she performed the procedure with a speed that suggested this was not her first time holding someone's heart in her hands while they bled out. Her fingers found the general's heart and began the manual compressions. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. The exact pressure required, the exact rhythm, sustained with the kind of focus that made time disappear. 30 seconds. 60 seconds. The monitor ticked silently. And then, sinus rhythm. A single beat, uncertain and fragile. Then another. The heart resumed its electrical activity like an engine catching after stalling. The attending surgeon immediately moved forward, and Elena stepped back, her hands releasing the general's heart to the surgical team who would open his chest properly, who would find the bleed site, who would repair what shrapnel had broken. Elena did not look at Ashford. She looked at the attending surgeon, who was staring at her blood-covered hands with an expression that mixed shock and recognition. She looked at the general's daughter, whose face had transformed from hopelessness to something fragile and alive. She looked at the general's monitor, which now showed the beautiful rhythm of sinus perfusion, the electrical proof that he was still here, still fighting. The attending surgeon's voice was quiet when he spoke. "Where did you learn to do that?" Elena did not answer. She had already turned toward the door, where hospital security was appearing with Ashford's frantic gestures behind them, and she recognized the moment for what it was, the moment before everything changed, the moment before the lights went out on the life she had carefully constructed, the moment before anyone knew what they were really standing next to. She wiped her hands on the trauma drape and walked back out the same door she had entered, her heart monitor of her own now beating with the steady, unstoppable rhythm of someone who had nothing left to lose. The scalpel was already moving before Elena's conscious mind finished the decision. Muscle memory took over, hands that had held lives together in the sand now cutting through fabric and skin with the precision of someone who had trained for exactly this moment, even if that training had ended 3 years ago in a hospital in Landstuhl. The 14-gauge needle went in. O2 climbing. 70. 75. 82. The attending surgeon stepped back, his face a landscape of shock, and Elena's hands moved on their own through the field thoracotomy, the same procedure she had performed under fire in Tikrit with nothing but adrenaline and muscle memory and the certainty that someone's son was not going to die on her watch. Not then. Not now. The general's heart was in her palm. Not metaphorically. She felt it there, cold, barely moving, the organ of a man who had held her during her son's funeral, who had written letters to her daughter-in-law that made the widow weep, who had knocked on their door at 0600 hours on a Tuesday to tell Elena that her son had died doing the thing he loved, protecting people he would never know. And now his heart was in her hands and it was barely beating, and the entire ICU was watching a nurse, a civilian nurse in Portland, perform open cardiac massage on a Navy SEAL general with the steady hands of someone who had already surrendered everything. Manual compression. The general's rhythm returned. 1 beat. 2 beats. 3. His body responded like a machine powering back to life, and Elena's breath came steady, controlled, the trembling not fear but restraint, the restraint of someone who understood that showing emotion in this moment would break the spell, would make the general's death retroactive, would unmake the last 6 seconds of work. The attending surgeon's voice cracked when he spoke, "Get him to OR. Now." It wasn't a request. It was a command spoken by a man who had just watched the hierarchy of Oak Creek Memorial collapse like a sandcastle in a storm. The stretcher wheels squeaked against the ICU tile as they moved the general toward surgery. Elena stepped back, her hands wet with blood that wasn't her own, and she watched him disappear through the double doors with the clinical detachment of someone who had learned long ago that you cannot grieve someone back to life. You can only work. You can only move forward. You can only keep your hand steady enough to hold what matters. Ashford was still standing at the ICU window, watching her through the glass with an expression that shifted across his face like weather systems, shock, then calculation, then something worse. Rage. The kind of rage that comes not from the heat of the moment but from the cold clarity of understanding that everything he had built on hierarchy and submission and the unquestioned authority of his white coat had just been demolished by a woman in scrubs who hadn't asked permission to save a man's life. She met his eyes through the window. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply turned toward the corridor and walked past the nurse's station, past the monitors that still showed the general's heart rhythm climbing back into the normal range, past the attending surgeon who was already calling ahead to the OR team. Nobody stopped her. Security had vanished the moment the general coded, the moment their protocols became irrelevant to whether a man lived or died. The next 6 hours were a kind of suspension. Elena sent home to the empty pediatric wing as if nothing had happened, the ICU staff around her moving with the quiet efficiency of people who had just seen something they couldn't explain, wouldn't report, were pretending not to remember. She sat at the nurse's station with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and she waited. Not for vindication. Not for gratitude. She waited because she understood the architecture of institutional power, understood that Ashford would be making phone calls, that the consequences of saving a man's life without permission were far worse than the consequences of letting him die. At 6:53 a.m., Ashford made the first call. Elena knew this not because she heard it, but because the charge nurse's expression shifted from relief to something closer to fear. The second call came at 7:15 a.m. She could hear the faint sound of his voice in his office down the corridor, the words indistinct but the tone unmistakable. Anger. Persuasion. The systematic dismantling of the narrative that had just played out in the ICU. By 8:02 a.m., 4 board members had been contacted. For conversations, each one carefully constructed to frame Elena's intervention not as heroism but as reckless endangerment, insubordination, a dangerous nurse who had violated security protocols and performed surgical procedures without authorization and had compromised the chain of command that kept hospitals functioning. Ashford didn't call her in for an explanation. He didn't request a meeting. Instead, at 9:15 a.m., when the shift was changing and the hospital was filling with day shift staff who would see her leaving, 2 security officers appeared at the locker room entrance with a cardboard box and the kind of expression that suggested they had drawn the short straw in whatever conversation had decided this moment was necessary. Major Martinez, one of them said, and Elena flinched at the rank, almost imperceptibly, a flicker in her jaw that suggested the universe was already beginning to crack at its seams. But she recovered. She gathered her things with mechanical precision, her personal items disappearing into the box, a sweater she kept for the cold OR, a photo of her son in dress uniform, the spare shoes she rotated every other shift. The dog tag stayed in her scrub pocket. That never left. The walk through the corridor felt longer than it should have. The staff averted their eyes. This was the unwritten law of hierarchical institutions. When someone fell, you did not acknowledge their falling. You did not make eye contact. You did not ask questions. You simply allowed them to disappear from your world as though they had never existed, as though their competence and their courage and the fact that they had saved a general's life 12 hours ago were all irrelevant now that the institutional apparatus had decided they were disposable. Ashford watched from his office window as she passed through the main lobby. Arms crossed. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who had reasserted control, who had reminded the hospital, reminded Elena herself, exactly who held the power in this place. She didn't look up at him. She didn't give him the satisfaction of her gaze. Instead, she held the cardboard box like it was made of something fragile, and she walked toward the parking garage with the same composure she had maintained in the ICU, the same composure she had maintained while Ashford humiliated her in front of a general and his family, the same composure that was the only armor she had left. The parking garage was empty at 9:11 a.m., most staff had already arrived, and the morning traffic had thinned to occasional cars drifting through the concrete cavern. She set the box on the passenger seat of her car, a 2003 Subaru with 98,000 miles and a crack in the windshield that looked like a lightning bolt, and she sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The dome light had been left on during her emergency run to the ICU. The battery was dead. She turned the key. Nothing. Not even a click. She tried again. Dead weight. Dead silence. The kind of failure that felt less like mechanical malfunction and more like the universe confirming what her gut already knew, that everything she had carefully constructed over 3 years was collapsing in real time, that the careful civilian life she had built after Tikrit was burning down behind her, that there was no forward motion available to her. Only the act of sitting here in the dark with a cardboard box of personal belongings and a dead battery and a dog tag that dug into her palm. Like a piece of shrapnel. The dog tag had belonged to her son. James Martinez. Rank, Petty Officer First Class. It had survived when he didn't. It had survived 3 years in her scrub pocket, through 2,847 shifts at Oak Creek Memorial, through every moment she had forced herself to smile at colleagues and defer to Ashford and pretend that she was just another competent nurse with steady hands and no complicated history. The dog tag was the only thing she had never told anyone about. The only thing that mattered. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of something that wasn't crying, wasn't quite breathing, wasn't quite stillness. Just the weight of everything she couldn't say, everything she had never said, everything that had gotten people killed in Tikrit and that had ended her career and that had driven her to this parking garage in Portland with a box of belongings and a dead battery and the complete understanding that she had just destroyed the last thing she was building. Her phone buzzed at 9:43 a.m. A message from the HR department, administrative review requested. Return to Oak Creek Memorial Conference Room tomorrow, 10 a.m. She stared at the message without responding. She knew exactly what administrative review meant. She knew exactly what the conference room conversation would entail: accusations, documentation, the formal machinery of institutional dismissal. She didn't have the strength to turn the key and call for a jump. She didn't have the strength to move. The general was stable in surgery. She had done that. Whatever happened next, whatever they called her, whatever they said she had done or hadn't done, the general was alive because she had climbed through a restricted ICU door and put her hands inside a man's chest and brought his heart back to life. Nobody could take that away from her. Nobody could untie that knot. But they could take the job. They could take the hospital. They could take the careful civilian life. And they were doing it right now, in real time, and she was sitting in a parking garage with a dead battery and no forward motion and 48 hours between the moment the general had arrived by helicopter and this exact moment of complete absence, complete silence, complete surrender. She didn't know yet that the general was awake. She didn't know yet that the conference room waiting for her at 10 a.m. the next morning held her son in dress uniform, held federal agents with sealed warrants, held the machinery of revelation that would begin to reassemble everything Ashford had just torn down. She only knew that the sun was climbing over Portland, that her phone was dark and quiet except for that single message from HR, and that true class is what you do when the lights go out. She was in the dark now. The lights had gone out. 48 hours. That's how long Elena sat in her car in the Oak Creek Memorial parking garage with the engine dead and her hands gripping the steering wheel like it might float away. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer above her, casting everything in the color of surrendered hope. She hadn't turned the key. Hadn't looked at her phone. Hadn't moved except to breathe, shallow and measured, the kind of breathing you do when the world has already taken everything it's going to take. Rain hammered the windshield. Thunder rolled across Portland like distant artillery, and she thought about Tikrit. She thought about holding a perimeter for 6 hours with rounds snapping past her head like angry wasps. She thought about how that had been easier than this, easier to fight an enemy you could see than to survive the slow erasure of a life you'd built in whispers. The phone buzzed on the passenger seat. HR Administrative Review. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., Conference Room B. She recognized the message for what it was, the formality before the door closes. The paperwork that precedes the silence. She didn't cry. The tears had stopped coming sometime in Tikrit, replaced by something harder and colder that didn't leak out of your eyes, it leaked out through your hands, your choices, the way you moved through rooms like you were already a ghost. She turned the key. The engine caught. She drove. Conference Room B smelled like old coffee and the particular despair of institutional fluorescent lighting. Elena arrived at 8:06 a.m., 7 minutes early because showing up late to her own execution seemed disrespectful to the process. The HR director, a woman named Patricia Voss who'd never met Elena's eyes in 3 years of passing in hallways, sat at the head of the mahogany table. 2 hospital board members flanked her like backup singers in a funeral chorus. Elena's chest was a locked room. Her face, a door that opened only when she decided it should. She sat down across from them. "Elena, thank you for coming in on such short notice." Patricia's voice had the careful gentleness reserved for people about to be dismantled. "As you know, your termination paperwork was filed yesterday due to insubordination and reckless endangerment of a patient. We're here today to finalize." The door opened. Elena's son stood at attention in full dress uniform. Navy blues pressed so sharp they could cut glass. His shoulders back. His jaw set like he'd been carved from resolve itself. Behind him, a wheelchair. General Marcus Webb, alive and awake and moving his eyes with the precision of a man who'd already died once and refused to do it again. Behind the general, a figure in desert tan camouflage with the bearing of someone accustomed to rooms obeying his presence. The SEAL commander. His face the color of polished mahogany, his eyes carrying the particular weight that comes from ordering people into situations where the odds don't favor coming home. "Major Martinez," her son said. "Not Elena. Not Mom. Major." The word landed like a salute. Patricia Voss's pen clattered against the table. The 2 board members stood reflexively, the way humans do when something suddenly becomes real in a way they don't yet understand. General Webb wheeled himself forward with the determination of a man learning to move again. His voice carried the rasp of someone whose lungs had recently been manually restarted, but it carried absolute authority. He pulled a file from his lap and opened it with trembling hands. "This patient file contains information classified at the secret level. The nurse listed as Margaret Henderson, RN, is actually Major Elena Martinez, United States Navy Medical Service Corps, with 3 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, including service in Tikrit from April 2011 to February 2012. Elena's son stood motionless. Her eyes forward. Her hands flat on the table because moving them would betray something she didn't want anyone to see. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The SEAL commander stepped forward. Major Martinez held a defensive perimeter at forward operating base Shank for 6 consecutive hours while under direct fire from Al-Qaeda insurgent positions. During that time, she treated 17 wounded soldiers with Class 3 and Class 4 injuries using field medicine protocols designed for exactly no supplies and maximum chaos. He paused. Each word deliberate as a measured breath. She earned the Bronze Star with Valor for that operation. She earned it by choosing duty over safety and by saving lives while rounds were passing through the walls around her. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain against the building's skin. Bronze Star with Valor, the commander continued, his voice steady as a surgical laser. Purple Heart, earned when shrapnel took out her left side during a medical evacuation operation. Combat Medical Badge. And her Army Commendation Medal, awarded for training indigenous medical personnel in trauma response protocols. Patricia Voss's hands were shaking. One of the board members had sat back down. The other remained standing, frozen, as if movement might accidentally commit him to a position his mind hadn't yet fully occupied. Elena didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't acknowledge any of this because acknowledgement would mean breaking character, and the character she'd built, the deferential, quiet, competent nurse, was the only reason she'd survived these 3 years. The mask had been armor. Now that armor was being stripped away in front of witnesses, and the hardest part was that it had to be done by other people. She couldn't have done it herself. The warrior inside had to be revealed by those who recognized warriors, not by someone performing recognition they didn't actually feel. The door opened again. 2 FBI agents in dark suits, moving with the particular efficiency of people executing a warrant they'd been looking forward to executing. They walked directly to Dr. Richard Ashford's empty chair. Dr. Richard Ashford, the senior agent said, checking his phone. "We have a warrant for your arrest based on charges of falsifying federal personnel records with intent to conceal a retaliation action against a protected individual holding active security clearances at the secret level." Patricia Voss stood up. "Ashford isn't here. He's on rounds. He's in his office. 3rd floor, East Wing." The commander said it quietly. Helpfully. The way someone offers directions to a place that's about to become a crime scene. The agents nodded and left. 20 seconds later, the intercom crackled with a code that Elena didn't recognize, and footsteps in the hallway became running. Her son's jaw didn't move. The general wheeled himself closer to Patricia Voss, and his voice dropped to something that was technically a whisper but somehow carried more weight than any shout could manage. "The nurse you fired yesterday saved my life twice. Once in Tikrit under fire. Once at 2:03 a.m. when your chief of medicine's hands were too scared to function. When you tried to bury her, you didn't just attack a nurse. You attacked a decorated officer of the United States military and triggered alerts on a classified security clearance that your institution had no clearance level to even know existed. That makes this a federal matter now." The arrest warrant was clean and surgical. The perp walk happened 90 minutes later, and Elena watched it from the conference room window. Dr. Richard Ashford emerged from the elevator with his wrists in stainless steel, and the lobby of Oak Creek Memorial became a collage of pulling phones and gasped recognitions. The morning staff who'd learned to nod and smile at his presence suddenly saw him the way she'd seen him all along, a man who'd built his authority on the submission of people who couldn't fight back. The ICU charge nurse Elena had worked with for 3 years stood with her arms crossed, watching him pass. The ER residents who'd eaten his criticisms like they were vegetables that were good for them simply watched, silent, as he stumbled past the station where he'd conducted morning rounds like a general inspecting troops. Dr. Ashford's face was the color of someone who'd just learned that the world was not constructed the way he'd believed it to be. Local news vans were already setting up outside the main entrance. The hospital board issued a statement by 11 a.m. citing abuse of authority and retaliatory practices. Ashford's medical license was referred to the state board. His employment was terminated effective immediately. By noon, someone had removed his nameplate from the office door. By 3 p.m., HR was investigating how many other staff members he'd retaliated against over his 20-year tenure, and the answer, it turned out, was 19. The write-up Elena had received disappeared from the unit board. In its place, someone, Elena never found out who, posted a single page with her Bronze Star citation printed in clean black text. The room fell silent when she entered it now, But this time, the silence was different. This time, chairs filled. This time, people made space. 6 months later, Elena stood in the executive wing of Oak Creek Memorial wearing a new ID badge with a title embossed beneath her name, Director of Emergency Medicine. General Webb, fully recovered and moving with the careful precision of someone whose body had been forcibly reassembled, insisted on attending the ceremony despite his daughter's concerns about his stamina. He stood without his wheelchair, his hand on her shoulder like a benediction, and the hospital board members who'd sat frozen in Conference Room B clapped with the particular enthusiasm of people grateful to have bet on the winning side. The dog tag hung beside her badge now on a proper chain. Not hidden. Not something she had to touch in bathrooms when the weight of pretending became too much to carry alone. Just there. Present. Real. Her first night as director, Elena walked through the lobby at 2:17 a.m. reviewing patient charts. The night security desk had been staffed by a new guard, a former Marine named Holloway who wore the uniform like it meant something. But when she looked at the desk schedule, she saw that one shift had been filled by someone whose face she recognized. Dr. Richard Ashford sat behind the security desk in a blue uniform 2 sizes too large, checking staff IDs with the particular care of someone learning that the world operated according to rules that had nothing to do with him. His retaliation against Elena had triggered a federal investigation that revealed falsified documentation going back 7 years. His medical license had been suspended pending review. His professional reputation had collapsed into a kind of professional non-existence. Their eyes met. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked down at his logbook and continued checking IDs. Elena didn't break stride. Didn't acknowledge him. She simply showed her director badge and walked past, the dog tag catching the fluorescent light for exactly 1 second as she moved. In her new office, she found a handwritten card from the general's daughter. You saved him twice, once in Tikrit, once here. Thank you for protecting him. The SEAL commander's note sat beside it. Warriors recognize warriors, regardless of the uniform. Elena touched the dog tag and thought about the choice she'd made 3 years ago to become someone other than who she was. The cost of that choice. The weight of walls built to hide rather than to protect. She pulled out her phone and typed a text to her daughter-in-law, dinner Sunday. I'm ready to talk about him. Through her office window, she could see the security desk below, where Dr. Ashford checked another staff ID, completely unknown to the people he was processing, no longer the architect of anything. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical prayer, and Elena, Major Elena Martinez, Director of Emergency Medicine, began her first night's work rebuilding the ER with the same precision she'd once used to hold perimeters. The dog tag caught the light again, and for the first time in 3 years, when it did, she didn't instinctively hide it. Her first executive decision wasn't a policy overhaul or a structural reorganization. It was a single protocol, implemented hospital-wide within the week, Emergency Medical Authority and Nursing Expertise Integration Framework. A system that honored hierarchical structure while creating protected pathways for frontline nursing staff to challenge medical decisions without fear of retaliation. It would prevent future Elenas from having to choose between following orders that would kill their patients and surviving the professional destruction that came from being right while subordinate. By 4 a.m., the first code of her tenure came through the doors. Trauma. Multiple injuries. Exactly the kind of crisis that separates the people who freeze from the people who'd already died once and refused to do it again. Elena moved into the trauma bay without any pretense of hesitation, and every person there, every resident, every nurse, every attending, recognized something in the way she moved that had nothing to do with her title. They recognized a warrior. And that, finally, was a thing that didn't require hiding anymore. Hit like if this story got you. And tell me, have you ever been underestimated at work, only to prove them all wrong? I read every comment. Subscribe if you haven't already.